Okay, just for sake of time, and I know Kylie has just fantastic information for today, I'm gonna get rolling. So my name is Lauren Dipson, and I am the Assistant Director here at the North Dakota State University Center for Immunization, Research, and Education. Today, I have the absolute pleasure to introduce Kylie Hall, who will be presenting the webinar titled "What's in Vaccines? The Purpose, Safety, and Science Behind Their Ingredients." Kylie is our very own operations director here at CIRE. Since joining NDSU in 2015, she has gained extensive experience in immunization policy and practice, vaccine communication strategies, addressing hesitancy, improving vaccine confidence, and reducing immunization disparities. She also works with immunization data to guide evidence-based improvement efforts. Kylie holds a Master's of Public Health, specializing in management of infectious disease, and a Bachelor of Science in Microbiology, both from NDSU. Kylie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. Super excited to be here to talk about a really important topic. What is in vaccines? So let's just get started. I've got a full slide deck for you today. I do want to start my presentation by saying this presentation would not have been possible without the expertise and the creativity of two of my colleagues that are both here on the call, Lauren and Maeve, on our CIRE team. And so I just want to publicly acknowledge and thank them for the contributions that they made to this presentation. Some disclosures for you. Myself, Maeve, and Lauren, we have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. We also have an AI attestation here. So the core concepts, clinical themes, and the outline of this presentation were entirely developed by our CIRE team. We did use AI tools, though, as an editorial tool to assist with text generation, some phrasing, and some conciseness. Here are the objectives for the presentation today. So we're going to describe the role of different vaccine ingredients like adjuvants, stabilizers, and preservatives. We'll recognize common misconceptions about vaccine ingredients using current evidence. And then we're going to discuss effective communication strategies that we can use to counsel patients when they have those questions about vaccine ingredients. So why are we talking about vaccine ingredients today? Well, vaccine ingredients have been in the news a lot lately, especially over the last 18 months, but these are not new concerns. We see it in the media, we see it online, it's in our news, it's in our social media, we hear about it in podcasts. U.S. healthcare providers also have patients coming in with more specific or technical questions, and they're not just questions about vaccines, but now they have questions about the ingredients in vaccines. And I can understand, like, truly, from the patient perspective, they want to make good decisions. They want to do what's best for their families or for their children, but they're making their decisions with information that's incomplete. It's not in context. Sometimes it's not even rooted in scientific evidence, and it's creating confusion and it's creating distrust, even in patients who are probably likely to vaccinate. So now, as healthcare providers, you have to know that you are the trusted source of information, especially around vaccines. And that's why webinars like this are really important. We are going to try and give you an overview of vaccine ingredients so you can be as prepared as possible to respond to patient questions confidently and to be able to address their concerns. All right, so what's actually in a vaccine? So vaccines contain several different types of ingredients, and each of them has a very specific purpose. What I would recommend is framing these vaccine ingredients by what they do, rather than simply listing their names. This can help patients better understand why they're there, and it'll help address many of their common concerns. So you're going to see this slide pop up throughout the presentation as we talk about the different ingredients that are in vaccines. So first, I'm just going to give a quick overview. So we have active ingredients. These are the parts that train the immune system. So depending on the vaccine, you might have a live virus, you might have an inactivated pathogen, you might have a weakened form or just a piece of a pathogen. This is going to generate that immune response and provide protection against disease. Next, we have adjuvants. These help the immune system respond more effectively to that active ingredient. Enhances the immune response, and it can help reduce the amount of antigen that's needed or the number of doses of a vaccine that's required to get that immune response. Some vaccines do include antibiotics, and these are present in very small amounts. They're used during the manufacturing process, and they're really just there to prevent bacterial contamination, and only there in trace amounts once you get to the final product. Then we have stabilizers. They're included to keep the vaccine effective during storage and transportation. They protect that active ingredient from changes that could occur from like temperature or light, Really, their purpose is to make sure the vaccine still works as intended when it reaches that patient. We have preservatives that help prevent contamination, really important in multi-dose vials where we might be going into that vial 3 or 5 or even 10 times. They ensure that if that vial is used more than once, bacteria or fungus don't grow in it. And then finally, we have trace components. So these are tiny residual amounts of different ingredients, oftentimes that are used during vaccine production. If at all, they're present in extremely small quantities, and this is a very carefully regulated process. But we're going to do a deep dive on all of these different ingredient types throughout the webinar. Before that, one last concept I want to talk about is on this slide here. So once you understand the different types of vaccines, you can actually make some pretty educated guesses about the kinds of ingredients that a vaccine might contain and why those ingredients might be there. So I like to think about vaccine ingredients the same way that you might think about baking cookies. So if I told you today I'm going to make chocolate chip cookies, you would probably have a pretty good idea of some of the ingredients I would need. So you're like, okay, Kylie needs flour, sugar, and chocolate chips. But depending on the recipe, I might use butter. You might use brown sugar instead of white sugar. Some of us use vanilla, baking soda. Maybe some of us sprinkle a little bit of cinnamon in there for some extra flavor, right? You might not know every single ingredient in a vaccine, but you're going to have a pretty general sense of like what to expect based on the type of like cookie I'm making, right? So vaccines are similar. So once you know what type of vaccine you're looking at, whether it's a live vaccine, an inactivated vaccine, subunit, genetic, you can make some pretty educated guesses about the kinds of ingredients that that vaccine might contain, and more importantly, why those ingredients are there. So we're going to start with live vaccines. I'm going to use measles as an example, but this could apply to other live vaccines too. So to make the vaccine, first I have to grow that measles virus in a living cell. And so for the measles vaccine, that's a chick embryo cell. After that virus is grown and purified, there may be tiny residual amounts of those cell proteins that are left behind. Because the virus has to stay alive until it's administered, it's a live vaccine. Live vaccines also contain stabilizers that protect that virus during storage and transport. And then during manufacturing, we might have like trace antibiotics that are used to prevent bacterial contamination. So again, you might see those tiny residual amounts remaining in your final vaccine product. With an activated vaccine, inactivated vaccines, the process is going to start pretty similarly. So you first have to grow large amounts of virus or bacteria. So that means that you may again see trace residual cell proteins from that manufacturing process. The pathogen has to be inactivated or killed somehow. That's often done using heat or chemicals or other methods. So there may be some trace residual amounts of those ingredients. Since inactivated vaccines don't replicate in the body, they often don't stimulate as strong of an immune response as like a live vaccine. So that's why you'll often see adjuvants in inactivated vaccines. They help strengthen that immune response. And then depending on the vaccine, you might also see stabilizers or preservatives or maybe even some buffering agents. Then we have subunit vaccines. So these contain only a really specific part of a pathogen that the immune system needs to recognize. We typically, in a subunit vaccine, you wouldn't see like the whole pathogen. You wouldn't see the whole virus or the whole bacteria. So that component might be a protein like the hepatitis B surface antigen, or it could be a sugar molecule from the bacterial capsule in PPSV23. But because these components are purified when the vaccine is being manufactured, you may see some trace residual materials from the cells that remain in the vaccines. You might also see some adjuvants to strengthen the immune response. Again, it's not a live vaccine, so we don't always get a strong immune response. Again, some stabilizers, some preservatives, and some buffering agents. And then finally, we have genetic vaccines, like mRNA vaccines would be an example here. They don't contain the pathogen or any part of the pathogen. Instead, they're delivering genetic instructions that our own cells take up and read those instructions to temporarily make that harmless piece of the virus. So because of that, you're not going to find ingredients related to growing or inactivating a virus, but instead you're going to see ingredients that protect and deliver that genetic material, like that lipid nanoparticle, that fatty bubble that holds that mRNA to help it go into cells. You're also going to see salts, sugars, buffering agents, and those all help keep the vaccine stable. So just like baking cookies, I probably have a pretty good idea of what's in a vaccine if I know what type of vaccine it is. All right, so we're going to go right into the meat and potatoes, if you will, of the presentation. We're going to start by talking about active ingredients. I will say we're not going to spend a ton of time on this particular section because most of the concerns about vaccine ingredients fall in the other categories on your screen. But one thing I do want to point out is that, yes, children today receive more vaccines than ever before. I would say that's a good thing because they're protected against many more diseases. But the total number of antigens that children are exposed to through the routine childhood vaccine schedule is actually way lower than it was 50 years ago. It's lower than it was even in 1900. And we were only giving one vaccine during that time, which was the smallpox vaccine. And you might be like, well, Kylie, how is that even possible? So vaccine technology has improved dramatically. Well, first and foremost, we're not using the smallpox vaccine. We've also replaced the whole cell pertussis vaccine with a much more refined acellular version, so many less antigens there. And then many modern vaccines contain only specific parts of a pathogen. We don't need to give a whole virus or a whole bacteria to generate a protective immune response anymore. We can use refined vaccines. So yes, while children receive more shots, they're actually exposed to far fewer antigens. And even those vaccine antigens, like the cumulative exposure from that is really tiny compared to like what the immune system of a child encounters every single day. So if any of you have ever been around kids, you know that they put everything in their mouth. They pick things off the floor, they eat food off the floor. They're exposed to hundreds, if not thousands of antigens every single day through just normal activities like eating, crawling, playing. The exposure from antigen, the antigenic exposure from vaccines is really just like a drop in the bucket compared to what they're exposed to every single day. All right, so now we're going to move on to some of the other vaccine ingredients. But before we do that, I want you to take a look at the list of chemicals on your screen. And I want you to think about whether you would consume this product. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but would you consume it just based on the ingredients alone? Think about that. Phenylacetate, ethylene gas, tocopherol, oleic acid, would you consume that? And I'll tell you, like, honestly, most of the time when I give this presentation, people are like, no, I don't think I'd eat that. I don't think I'd drink that. I don't know what it is, but I don't want it. I don't think that's abnormal. I think people care about what they put on their bodies. And this list on your screen is full of unknown chemicals with names that like you can barely pronounce, right? We question the safety because we see like oleic acid. Ooh, what is that? Can it really be safe? I want to tell you, like, I get it. I get it. I understand the hesitation, but what if I told you these are some of the chemicals that are found in a banana? Suddenly, doesn't seem as scary, right? Of course we'd eat a banana. My kids love bananas. But I want you to remember just a minute ago when I asked you whether or not you'd consume this product with long, unfamiliar ingredient names, no context, you had this uneasy feeling. Most people, me included, we don't speak the language of chemistry. So when we see a long scientific name, it's really easy to assume that because it sounds complicated, it could be harmful. But the name of the ingredient, it doesn't tell you whether it's safe. I don't know anything about oleic acid. What's important, it's the dose, it's its purpose, and its context. Everything around us, including the foods we eat, even our own bodies, like we're all made up of chemicals, and everything has a chemical name. Okay, so now we're going to pivot back to vaccines. I talked about bananas for 2 minutes, but now let's go back to vaccines. Their ingredient list can also look a little bit scary if you don't recognize the names. We got sodium chloride. That's also known as table salt. Sucrose is a sugar. Monosodium phosphate, it's a type of salt that helps keep the vaccine stable. We have aluminum salts for boosting the immune response. We have gelatin. This is an ingredient that's in gummy bears to keep the vaccine stable. But you get the pattern, right? Like just like bananas, chemical names can sound scary. And that's just until you realize that there's everyday substances with really important jobs. So the key point here for patients is that the name of the ingredient doesn't determine safety. We need context, we need dose, we need to know more about its function. And that's our role as healthcare providers, right? Help translate these unfamiliar terms, these unfamiliar concepts into something more understandable, less alarming. And then patients can make decisions based on that information rather than just how something sounds, okay? So here are some of the common flaws that you've probably seen or heard about vaccines, particularly vaccine ingredients. We're going to touch on many of these flaws today throughout the presentation. You may have seen claims that lack a basic understanding of chemistry and toxicology. There's inaccurate levels of exposure reported. We fail to report why a toxin is in a vaccine, fail to differentiate between something that's an acute exposure like a vaccine and a chronic exposure. And then certainly there's this fear of unnatural chemicals, which in my perspective could be a whole webinar in itself. There's a famous quote from Paracelsus. He's often considered the father of toxicology. It's commonly summarized as essentially like the dose makes the poison. The full quote is, All things are poison. Nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so a thing is not a poison. So think about that for a minute. All things are poison. Even water, something that we absolutely need to survive, can become dangerous if consumed in large enough amounts. Whether something is harmful doesn't depend on, what it is, but it's how much you're exposed to. So when we talk about vaccines and when we talk about dose, it helps to understand that the scale that we're talking about, right? So I want you to imagine a small blueberry. A small blueberry weighs about 1 gram. If you divided that blueberry into 1,000 equal pieces, each piece would be a milligram. Divide one of those pieces into 1,000 more pieces, you have a microgram. Take one of those pieces and divide it 1,000 more times, you have a nanogram. Many vaccine ingredients are present in these incredibly small amounts, quantities like I don't even know if I can conceptualize because I can't visualize like how small those quantities are, right? So when we talk about vaccine ingredients, you're going to hear about substances that, yes, at very high doses or under very different circumstances, they can cause harm. But that is not the same as saying that they're harmful in the tiny amounts found in vaccines. The presence of an ingredient alone doesn't determine whether it's safe. We need to know about the dose, the purpose, and the context. So if there's like one concept that I hope you'll remember throughout this presentation, it's this: it's the dose makes the poison. All right, so let's zoom in on adjuvants. So like we've mentioned, adjuvants improve the immune response to the vaccine. Sometimes it works actually by keeping the vaccine at the injection site for a little bit longer or by stimulating local immune cells. That allows vaccines to use lower quantities of antigens, and that actually can help reduce the number of doses required. So here's a list of the vaccines that have adjuvants. You'll notice there's one flu vaccine that has an adjuvant. Aluminum is the most common adjuvant, and then shingles, the RSV vaccine Arexvy, and the COVID-19 vaccine made by Novavax also have adjuvants. And that's it. So the vaccine ingredient that probably receives the most attention in terms of like adjuvants is aluminum. Often you'll see it in vaccines as an aluminum salt. So one common misconception is that aluminum is a heavy metal. So in fact, aluminum is a light metal, and it's one of the most abundant metals in Earth's crust. Aluminum salts, you might find this interesting. They've been used safely as vaccine adjuvants since 1926. So 100 years ago, we started using aluminum adjuvants in vaccines. So we have a century of experience and extensive safety data around the use of aluminum in vaccines. Adjuvants, again, are important because sometimes vaccines can't produce a strong enough immune response on their own, but that adjuvant can help stimulate that immune response. So it's the third most abundant element on Earth, making up nearly 9% of our Earth's crust. Aluminum, you guys, is literally everywhere. It's in soil, water, air, plants, food. Paul Offit would say that if you want to avoid aluminum, you need to move to a different planet because it is everywhere. Most adults consume about 7 to 9 milligrams of aluminum daily through their normal diet. You might be interested to hear like it's in foods. It's even in things like breast milk. It's been safely used in various products for decades. It's used in food packaging, antacid, antiperspirants. It's all around us. If you see the amounts on the right, that's the amount of aluminum in the different vaccines that contain it. Worth pointing out that aluminum is not used in live vaccines. Live vaccines typically can generate a strong enough immune response without an adjuvant. So MMR, varicella, rotavirus do not have any aluminum in them. All right, so now we're going to do a comparison between the amount of aluminum in our diet and that in vaccines. So from dietary exposure, the average person throughout their life will receive between 468 milligrams of aluminum and 2,785. Through a child's second birthday, typically their cumulative aluminum exposure from food is between 3 and 18 milligrams. From birth to 18 years, it's somewhere between 73 to 438 milligrams of aluminum. And then from the 19th birthday on, typically somewhere between 395 to 2,347 milligrams of aluminum. So we get a lot of aluminum through our daily diet. So then what do we get from vaccines? So cumulative lifetime exposure from vaccines is about 12 milligrams. From birth until 2 years old, we get about 4.4 milligrams of aluminum. If you do cumulative exposure through the 18th birthday, it's just under 8 milligrams. And then 19 years and older, the vaccines that are recommended from adults have less than 5 milligrams of aluminum cumulatively. I think it's also helpful to compare the amount of aluminum in vaccines compared to other sources or other exposures that we may have. So like I mentioned in vaccines, typically in that first 2 years of life, somebody will receive about 4 milligrams of aluminum from vaccines. But children are exposed to aluminum every single day. So breastfed infants in the first 6 months of life have about 7 milligrams of aluminum exposure. Formula-fed infants get about 38 milligrams of aluminum in that first 6 months. And then soy formula-fed infants, it's about 117 milligrams of aluminum. Antacids are relatively high in aluminum if you're going to do a comparison, upwards of 208 milligrams per tablet. Many people take multiple tablets a day, and our bodies process that amount of aluminum just fine. And then the average monthly adult dietary intake is about 270 milligrams for an average adult. One question that we often hear is aluminum different when it's injected versus ingested? So the answer is like yes and no. So when we eat aluminum in food or drink it in water, less than 1% is absorbed through like our digestive system, right? Most of it just simply passes through our body. Now remember, although only a small percentage is absorbed, we're exposed to a lot more aluminum through our diet over time than we receive from vaccines. But that said, vaccines are different because they get injected into muscle rather than us swallowing them. So that doesn't mean though that aluminum immediately enters our bloodstream. Aluminum adjuvants are just released gradually from the injection site over time, which is actually one of the ways that they help stimulate a strong immune response. But once it enters the bloodstream, the body handles it the same way, regardless of where it came from. So whether it came from food or whether it came from a vaccine, it's transported in the blood, the kidneys do a lot of the work, and then it's eliminated in the urine. So about 50 to 70% is cleared within the first 24 hours, and then about 80% of it is cleared in 2 weeks. And that's in people with normal kidney function, right? The important takeaway here is that the amount of aluminum provided through vaccination is very small compared with the amount that we're exposed to from food and the environment over our lifetime. And our bodies, because it's everywhere, our bodies are really well equipped to process it and to eliminate it. So a common concern is that aluminum in vaccines may increase the risk of autism or other health conditions. And so I want to review one of the strongest studies to date that addresses this question. It was published recently using data from 1.2 million children in Denmark. So it's so interesting. I love this study. Researchers were able to calculate how much aluminum each child received from vaccines during the first 2 years of life. So you can see here in this graph, they have different birth cohorts from 1997 to 2018. And you can see how much aluminum exposure those kids had throughout their first 2 years of life just by looking at what vaccines they have. Then they asked a really simple question. Were children who received more aluminum from vaccines more likely to develop health problems? They looked at 50 different health outcomes, including things like neurodevelopmental disorders like autism, autoimmune diseases, allergic conditions. So the graph shows the different birth cohorts, the range of cumulative aluminum exposure, and the results were really reassuring. So children who received more aluminum from vaccines were not at increased risk for any of the categories of diseases studied. In fact, and this is really reassuring to me, if aluminum adjuvants were causing these conditions, if they did cause autoimmune conditions, if they did cause autism, we would expect to see what's called a dose-response relationship. So children who got more aluminum would have higher rates of disease than children who received less. And this pattern was not observed. And this is really reaffirming the safety profile of aluminum in vaccines. And this study was just published last year. So really reassuring for us. All right, so throughout the presentation here, you're going to see some conversation pearls for the different vaccine ingredients. I'm just going to pick one out of each slide. These slides are going to be available for you after the presentation, so feel free to pull them from our website. But I'm going to use the first example on this slide. So if you have a patient who comes in and says, like, I'm worried about the aluminum in vaccines, I would recommend avoiding a statement like, there's aluminum in everything, so it's not a problem. Try this instead. I'm glad you brought that up. Aluminum has been used in some vaccines for decades to help the immune system build a stronger response. The amount is very small, and babies and children are exposed to more aluminum through food, formula, breast milk, water, and the environment than they receive from vaccines. What questions do you have about how it's used? All right, so we're going to do a quick knowledge check. I just want you to answer this question in your head. What is the primary purpose of an adjuvant in a vaccine? So is it A, to prevent bacterial contamination, B, to boost the immune response to the vaccine, C, keep the vaccine stable during storage, or D, kill viruses during manufacturing? So if you answered B, that is the correct answer. Adjuvants boost the immune response to the vaccine. All right, so next we're going to talk about stabilizers. Stabilizers prevent chemical reactions from occurring within the vaccine, and they truthfully, like, they just help keep the vaccine components from sticking to the vaccine vial. You'll see things like sugars, amino acids, gelatin, and proteins as different stabilizers that are used in vaccines. But gelatin is one of the ones that we get regular questions on. So gelatin is a protein that's formed by boiling skin or connective tissue and treating it chemically. Gelatin is typically of porcine origin, porcine meaning pork, meaning from pigs. But there is one vaccine, and we'll talk about that on the next slide, that comes from cows. It's commonly found in foods like Jell-O, gummy candies, marshmallows, also found in like cosmetics, ointments, pharmaceutical capsules, and that's just a few examples. But gelatin acts as a stabilizer, so it protects the vaccine from damage during freeze drying, during storage, and during transport. So like I said, most gelatin in vaccines is porcine in origin, but the rabies vaccine, which uses gelatin, is of bovine origin, so from cows. Regarding safety, gelatin overall is very safe, but it's the most commonly identifiable cause of severe allergic reactions to vaccines. So that is worth noting regarding gelatin. But even that safety signal is very, very rare. So there's about 1 case of anaphylaxis to gelatin per 2 million doses administered. So most commonly identifiable, still incredibly rare. All of the vaccines on the right there are listed that contain gelatin with the amounts. Here's a question that may be relevant to populations that you serve. So can Muslims, Jews, or Seventh-day Adventists receive vaccines that contain porcine gelatin? The answer is yes. So religious authorities from these faith traditions have generally determined that vaccines containing porcine gelatin are permissible. You might say, well, why is that? Well, first and foremost, most vaccines are not consumed as food. The gelatin's very purified. They want to prioritize protecting health and preventing disease, and the benefits of vaccination outweigh the dietary concerns there might be. I'll also point out here, for some routine vaccines, there might be an alternative formulation without porcine gelatin. So for example, MMR2, if your clinic's using MMR2, that has a porcine gelatin in it. Priorix, the other MMR vaccine, does not have porcine gelatin. But I will say, like, some clinics don't stock both vaccines. Accessibility might be an issue if you're looking for Priorix in your community. So it might not always be an option, but I did just want to point it out if this is a common concern that you're hearing in your clinic. I will say though, like varicella vaccine is an exception. There is not an alternative for that routine vaccine without a pork gelatin option. All right, next we're going to talk about polysorbate 80. Polysorbate 80, it's another vaccine ingredient. It often raises questions, but mostly I think it comes from the name sounds unfamiliar or it just sounds chemical. So polysorbate 80, it's an emulsifier. Emulsifier means that it helps keep vaccine ingredients evenly mixed and stable. So I want you to think of what would happen if I mixed water and oil in a bottle. You know that eventually they would separate, right? But if you had an emulsifier, they may stay mixed. So in vaccines, emulsifiers prevent components from separating, and it's just helping to ensure that safe, consistent, effective dose of the vaccine is given every single time. Polysorbate 80 is commonly found in lotions, makeup, shampoos, conditioners, medication, vitamins, supplements, foods, all these things. So it's not unique to vaccines. It serves a similar purpose in those ingredients around maintaining texture, stability, and preventing the separation. So polysorbate 80 is also used as an emulsifier in ice cream to make it smooth and to slow its melting. A typical serving of ice cream is about a half cup. That's not my serving, but that's a serving of ice cream. It may contain about 170,000 micrograms of polysorbate 80. Compare that to like the polio vaccine, which has 100 micrograms. 100 micrograms of polysorbate 80. So you're literally talking about 1,700 times the amount of polysorbate 80 in ice cream than in 1 dose of polio vaccine. Okay, so and then lastly, I'll just say there's no evidence to suggest that polysorbate 80 causes adverse health outcomes. All the vaccines that have polysorbate 80 are listed on the right-hand side just for reference. All right, so a conversation pearl for stabilizers might be, I avoid pork products for religious reasons. I heard this vaccine contains gelatin from pork, and I don't think I should get it. You would want to avoid something like your religion allows it. Okay, let's try something. Let's try a different approach. You could say something like, I'm really glad you brought that up. Many of my patients have questions about pork products and vaccines because it raises religious concerns. I'd be happy to discuss what we know about pork gelatin and vaccines, how religious leaders have approached the issue, and whether alternative options might be available. All right, knowledge check. Which ingredient is primarily used to keep vaccines stable during storage? So is it neomycin, aluminum salts, gelatin, or formaldehyde? If you said gelatin, you would be correct. All right, next we're going to talk about preservatives. So preservatives protect vaccines from bacterial and fungal contamination. Really, I would say especially important for multi-dose vials that we're going to enter into multiple times. We've used several preservatives in vaccines over the years, but the preservative that receives the most public attention is thimerosal. So that's the one we're going to take a closer look at and look a little bit at what the evidence shows us. So thimerosal is a preservative that contains a form of mercury called ethyl mercury. It's been used in vaccines since the 1930s. You may or may not know this, but in the late 1990s, the U.S. Public Health Service and the American Academy of Pediatrics recommended removing thimerosal from routine childhood vaccines, really just as a precautionary measure. There was no evidence that the ethyl mercury in thimerosal was causing any harm, but really this was just done as a desire to reduce overall mercury exposure in children whenever possible, and really was done to maintain public confidence in vaccines. So by the year 2001, thimerosal had been removed from vaccines routinely recommended for children in the United States. There's one exception: some multi-dose flu vaccines do still contain thimerosal, but it only makes up about 4% of the U.S. flu vaccine supply. So thimerosal, again, is a preservative that contains a form of mercury called ethyl mercury. Similar to aluminum, mercury is naturally occurring, found in the Earth's crust. It's in air, it's in soil, it's in water. But unlike aluminum, mercury is considered a heavy metal, and that's one of the reasons that thimerosal raised concerns. So in the late 1990s, again, people worried that vaccines containing thimerosal might expose children to unsafe amounts of mercury. And that concern led to a great deal of research. And what scientists found was there was a really critical difference between the type of mercury in vaccines and the type of mercury that people hear about, like with environmental contamination. So thimerosal contains ethyl mercury, which you see on the left-hand side of your slide here. The mercury that can accumulate in certain fish and seafood is methyl mercury. Now, their names sound similar, but they behave very differently in the body. So ethyl mercury is broken down and eliminated relatively quickly, so it doesn't build up in the body. Methyl mercury, on the other hand, is cleared much more slowly and it can accumulate over time, which is why high levels of environmental exposure can be really harmful. Now, people will sometimes ask me like, oh, Kylie, I can't wrap my head around how they both contain mercury, but one is more dangerous. And like, I totally get that. I'm not a chemist either. But the analogy that I often use is like a reference to alcohols. So we all recognize that the alcohol in our favorite happy hour cocktail, whether it be beer or wine or something else, that kind of alcohol is ethanol. It is very different than methanol, which is found in products like windshield washer fluid. It can be highly toxic. They both belong to the alcohol family, but their effects on the body are like completely different. So mercury compounds work the same way. Just because two compounds both contain mercury doesn't mean that they'll behave the same way in the body, which I think is worth remembering. So because thimerosal contains mercury, some people hypothesize that it might contribute to autism. What I would say to that is if thimerosal were a major cause of autism, we would expect autism rates to decline after it was removed from all routinely recommended childhood vaccines. And that happened in the year 2001. As you can see from the graph on my screen here, that didn't happen. Autism diagnoses continued to increase. Researchers believe this increase is due in large part to things like broader diagnostic criteria. You can see on your slide here, the red line is decreasing for intellectual disability. A lot of those diagnoses are now being captured by autism, but there's other reasons as well. Like we have greater awareness of autism spectrum disorder. We have improved screening tools. We're identifying cases earlier. We've changed our diagnostic practices as well. And while these factors explain a lot of the increase, they don't account for all of it. And I think we need to be honest about that. Researchers continue to study the complex genetic and environmental factors that contribute to autism. So what do we know about the causes of autism? Well, research suggests that it's caused by a complex combination of environmental and genetic factors that are listed on your screen here. I'll point out a webinar that we had last July, and the recording is up on our YouTube page, all about the science of vaccines and autism. If you want to learn more about that topic, highly suggest you go and watch that webinar. It's excellent. We also have a video on our YouTube page all about vaccines and autism as well. But now going back to thimerosal, this has been in the news more over the last year because of our current HHS secretary. So historically, he has promoted a link between thimerosal and autism. So this goes all the way back to like 2005. So in 2005, he wrote an article. It was titled Deadly Immunity. It was published in Rolling Stone and on Salon, and it argued that thimerosal was linked to autism. Both publications later distanced themselves from the piece, but again, like the damage is done here, right? 2014, he publishes a book advancing similar claims, drawing sharp criticism from scientists and physicians because it had misstated evidence and exaggerating the risk of thimerosal. Go ahead a couple more years, 2016, he helps found the World Mercury Project. This was later rebranded to the Children's Health Defense, which is maybe how you know it now. But this is a group known for their anti-vaccine advocacy and misinformation. And all of this is setting the stage for the things and the actions that have taken place in his role as HHS secretary. So June 9th last year, he dismisses all 17 members of the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, and he installs a new committee, right? At their first meeting, they recommend removing thimerosal containing influenza vaccines from the US market, and then HHS adopts that recommendation. This decision was made with no new data, with decades of research and repeated reviews showing that thimerosal in vaccines does not pose a safety concern. Now, it's worth noting that like only about 4% of our influenza vaccines used in the US contain this product. So it's not like a huge impact on our US vaccine supply, but we express concern because this decision reinforces like these public misconceptions that thimerosal is not safe or that vaccines are not safe. And it just draws, it sows mistrust and confusion around the public. I will say that a federal judge has temporarily blocked the implementation of this decision while this is going to get worked out in the courts. But again, more confusion and distrust has come about. Now, fast forward to January of this year, the implications continue to extend beyond the United States even now. So more recently, Secretary Kennedy announced that the U.S. would withhold funding from Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, until it phases out vaccines that contain thimerosal. Now, this is much more impactful for Gavi because about 14% of their vaccine portfolio contains thimerosal. This is primarily in multi-dose vials that we use in low and middle income countries. And this is going to impact global vaccine access and ultimately immunization programs. We all know that vaccine preventable diseases are just a plane ride away. And with lower or more challenges in the international vaccine space, that could have ripple effects in the United States. But then just a few weeks ago, there was a significant development. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced that we are going to resume the funding of Gavi. And then on June 8th, Gavi says they'll accelerate their transition away from thimerosal-containing vaccines to help restore funding. So while the science surrounding thimerosal hasn't changed, we have no new data showing it's not safe or anything like that. The policy landscape is just continuing to evolve around this topic. Just like a reminder, I think, for us that discussions about vaccine ingredients are influenced not only by scientific evidence, but also by policy and global health priorities. Experts say there's no evidence that thimerosal has adverse neurological or neurodevelopmental adverse outcomes when used as a preservative in vaccines. Raising this topic now has one purpose: to sow distrust in vaccines in general and in the process to determine vaccine safety. So if you hear a patient with a concern, I'm going to use the second one here. If thimerosal is safe, why is the government trying to remove it from vaccines? You would want to avoid something like, it's just politics. Try instead, I can see why that might seem confusing. Thimerosal was removed from nearly all routine childhood vaccines more than 25 years ago as a precautionary measure, even though there was no new evidence it was causing harm. Current discussions about thimerosal involve policy decisions rather than new evidence showing it's unsafe. I would be happy to explain what thimerosal is used for and what the research tells us about its safety. All right, next we are going to talk about antibiotics. So antibiotics are used in vaccines, mostly in the manufacturing process. They're used to prevent bacterial contamination while the vaccine's being made. Most are removed during the purification process, but you're going to get some trace quantities that remain in some vaccines. Examples are like neomycin, polymyxin B, streptomycin, and gentamicin. I would never ask anybody to memorize anything that's on this slide. It's mostly just a reference for you. What I will point out about this slide is that antibiotics most likely to cause severe allergic reactions like penicillin, cephalosporins, sulfa drugs are not used in vaccine manufacturing. If a patient has a concern like, I'm worried my child could have an allergic reaction because there are antibiotics in vaccines, you'd want to avoid it's just a tiny amount, so it's not a concern. Try instead, like, I can understand why you'd think about that. Some vaccines contain trace amounts of antibiotics like neomycin to help keep bacteria from growing while the vaccine's being made. The antibiotics most likely to cause allergic reactions, like penicillin, aren't used in vaccines. Serious allergic reactions to vaccine antibiotics are very rare. Has your child ever had an allergic reaction to a medication or to a vaccine before? That would be one conversation pearl. All right, next we're going to talk about other trace components. So there are tiny amounts of various ingredients that are used during manufacturing or while the vaccine is being produced. And again, like I said, sometimes they can remain after the purification process. The ingredients are going to vary based on the manufacturing process, but they could include things like egg proteins, formaldehyde, antibiotics, which we just talked about. Residual traces of these ingredients that are present in the vaccine are in such small quantities, like they're measured as like parts per million, maybe even parts per billion. So first we're going to talk about formaldehyde. So many people recognize formaldehyde because they've heard that it can be harmful or that it can cause cancer at high levels. So that is true. At high concentrations with prolonged like exposure, formaldehyde can damage cells and increase the risk of certain cancers. But as we've talked about throughout this entire presentation, the dose really matters. So in vaccines, formaldehyde is used during the manufacturing process to inactivate viruses and to detoxify bacterial toxins. And that allows them to stimulate that immune response, but not cause disease. And then after the manufacturing process is complete, only those trace amounts, if any, remain in the vaccines. Also important to just remember with formaldehyde, like formaldehyde is not unique to vaccines. Our own bodies produce it. We encounter it every day in the environment. It's in the air, it's in certain foods, many household and building materials. Our bodies are well equipped to break down and eliminate these really small amounts. So formaldehyde, not just something found in vaccines. Like I said, it's actually a substance our bodies naturally produce every day as part of biological processes. We use it in protein and DNA synthesis. Infants, interestingly, if you took an infant, so I'm going to say like a 2-month-old infant, about 5 kilograms, which is just over 10 pounds. If you're in the US, infants have that size of infant has about 10 to 220 times the amount of formaldehyde circulating in their bloodstream than they would ever receive from a vaccine. Okay. And then you can see on the right-hand side, the small amount of formaldehyde that may be left as a residual ingredient in vaccines. Some people are surprised to learn that pears contain formaldehyde, but remember, formaldehyde is a naturally occurring substance. We're exposed to it every day. A typical pear contains about 12,000 micrograms of formaldehyde, while vaccines contain a trace amounts, maybe like 100 micrograms per dose. Now, we talked about this with aluminum, and I'll talk about it now. It's true, like eating formaldehyde and receiving a tiny residual amount in a vaccine, they're not exactly the same. They are processed differently in the body, but the reassuring news is that both are considered safe. So studies have shown that the really small amount of formaldehyde that remains in vaccines is rapidly cleared from the injections, like typically within about 30 minutes. And FDA scientists concluded that it's implausible that residual formaldehyde in vaccines would pose a safety risk. So here's a conversation pearl for you. Formaldehyde causes cancer. Why would that be in a vaccine? It sounds so dangerous. You'd want to avoid something like it's in such tiny amounts that it doesn't matter. Try instead, I understand why that sounds concerning. Formaldehyde can be harmful at high levels, but it's not something our bodies naturally make in small amounts as part of normal processes. There's very little formaldehyde in these vaccines, and the tiny amount is lower than what's already in our body. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. All right, next we're going to talk about residual cell materials. So if you go all the way back, remember earlier in the presentation, I mentioned that before a vaccine can be made, the virus or the bacteria, it has to be grown in cells or it has to be grown in like a specialized growth media. Even after extensive purification, trace amounts of those materials may still remain. So I'm going to spend a few minutes here talking about why those residual cell materials, or excuse me, what they are, why they're there, and why we don't consider them a safety concern. As you can see on this slide, different vaccines can use different production systems. So some are grown in eggs, which we talked about with the measles virus and like the chick embryos, I guess. They're kind of different. Others are grown in yeast, bacteria, insect cells, mammalian cells. But what's important to remember is that once the antigen's been produced, it goes through multiple purification steps to remove any of those growth materials. But again, some of them may still remain at trace levels. All right, so I wanted to show this process visually because I think it helps us understand how residual cell materials can end up in a vaccine and why they're present only at trace levels. It's a little sciencey, but hang with me here. So this is an example of how an influenza vaccine is made, okay? So first, we got to select the influenza virus strains that are going to go in the vaccine. These viruses are then grown in chicken eggs where they replicate. Next, the virus is harvested from the eggs. And at this point, the virus is mixed with egg proteins and other cellular materials. So it goes through multiple purification steps. One of them could be filtering. Large debris is filtered out. The virus is inactivated with formaldehyde, so it can't cause disease anymore, but it can still stimulate that immune response. And then processes like centrifugation and other purification steps are used. And that further separates the virus and the viral antigen from any surrounding materials. And then by the end of this process, what's left is just purified viral antigen, and that's what's used to make the vaccine. There may be tiny residual amounts of like egg proteins or formaldehyde that remain, but the vast majority is removed through the purification steps. And that's why we refer to these ingredients as residual materials. They're not ingredients that are added for like a purpose. They're just trace remnants of the manufacturing process that can remain even despite extensive purification. So what if your patient has an egg allergy? Well, people with egg allergy can receive any age-appropriate flu vaccine, including egg-based and non-egg-based products. Worth noting, some influenza vaccines are made using egg-based products and can contain trace amounts. But the recommendation applies even for patients with a history of severe egg allergy. For patients who prefer to avoid egg-based vaccines, there are egg-free influenza vaccine options available. For people receiving a traditional flu vaccine, no additional precautions are recommended beyond those that you would do for any other routine vaccination. And worth remembering, severe allergic reactions to flu vaccines are extremely rare. All right, we had a lot of questions about this pre-webinar, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about fetal cells and vaccines. So in various stages of vaccine development and manufacturing, some vaccines have used cells originally isolated from fetal tissue. We often call these fetal cell lines. So some of these cell lines were originally established from tissue obtained following elective terminations of pregnancy, and this happened decades ago. Even though fetal cell lines are used to grow vaccine viruses, vaccines do not contain fetal cells, nor do they contain parts of fetuses. So again, once that virus has been grown, it goes through multiple purification steps to remove the cells and other materials used during the manufacturing process. And during purification, any remaining cellular DNA is broken down into extremely small fragments that can remain. They don't always remain, but they could be present in residual trace amounts. So as a result, vaccines do not contain fetal cells, nor do they alter a vaccine recipient's DNA. Also worth noting, the last point on this slide is it's important to know that any vaccine that relies on these historic cell lines does not require or solicit new abortions. The same cell lines that were established decades ago are continuing to be maintained and used in laboratories today. So in what way are fetal cells used in vaccine development and production? Sometimes they're used in design and development, sometimes in production, and sometimes as confirmatory lab tests on production. Now, you might remember, like Kylie, you told us earlier that some pathogens will grow in animal cells. I did tell you that. In order to grow a virus for a vaccine, it needs a cell to grow in. And there are just some human cells that just don't grow well in animal cells. And so we need human cells to grow those viruses in. There are other reasons that we prefer fetal cells. So one of them is cell life. Almost all cells die after dividing a certain number of times. It's around 50 divisions. It's called the Hayflick limit. Because fetal cells have not divided as much, they're much younger than like my cells, they can be used longer. Fetal cells also come from the womb, which is a sterile environment. The cell lines should be free of contamination with unwanted viruses. Humans, animals, we might be contaminated with viruses. They might be harmless, but we might not know that. And so fetal cells are isolated from that sterile environment, so they're less likely to be infected with other viruses. And then lastly, they're stable. They can be maintained at low temperatures. It allows scientists to continue using cell lines from decades ago. Worth pointing out that major religious groups generally view the use of vaccines developed using fetal cell lines as morally acceptable, primarily because the potential for saving lives outweighs the remote connection to historical abortions. I'll read the statement on the screen here from the National Catholic Bioethics Center. It says, individuals should, when possible, use vaccines not developed with the use of these human cell strains. However, in the case where the only vaccine available against a particular disease was developed using this approach, one is morally free to use the vaccine regardless of its historical association with abortion. And then on your screen here, you can see the different vaccines that use fetal cells. So the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines use them for development and proof of concept. And Hep A, rubella, rabies, and varicella use it to grow the virus for those vaccines. I'll put in a shameless plug here. I think we have a really great 20-minute video on the use of fetal cells and vaccines on our website and on our YouTube page. The QR code is on your screen here, and I believe Lauren or Maeve is going to drop that link in the chat for you to open up and watch at a later date. All right, so some conversation pearls here for you. We're going to use the first one. So I've heard these vaccines contain fetal cells, and I'm uncomfortable receiving something connected to abortion. You'd want to avoid something like, there aren't any fetal cells in the vaccine, so you don't need to worry about that. Try instead something like, I understand that this can be a deeply personal concern. Some vaccines were developed using cell lines that originated from elective abortions many decades ago, but the vaccines themselves do not contain fetal cells. Many religious organizations, including the Catholic Church, have reviewed this issue and concluded that receiving these vaccines is morally acceptable because they help prevent disease. I'm happy to talk through any questions or concerns that you may have. All right, last knowledge check. Which of the following vaccine ingredients is considered a trace component that may remain after manufacturing? Is it antigen, formaldehyde, aluminum salts, or gelatin? Think about that for a minute. The answer is formaldehyde. If you said formaldehyde, you got that one right. All right, we're coming up on the end of my slide deck here. Let's talk a little bit about mRNA vaccine ingredients. So currently approved mRNA vaccines contain roughly 4 ingredients. So they have the mRNA, they have the lipid nanoparticle, that fatty bubble that delivers the mRNA, sugars used as stabilizers, and then some salts and buffers that help maintain the pH. Especially during the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, we got a lot of questions about, can mRNA vaccines alter your DNA? And ultimately, this comes down to vaccine ingredients. So we're going to talk about it. I also am going to say we're going to get a little sciencey here for a minute, so bear with me. So what do mRNA vaccines do? I don't know if you guys can see my mouse here. I'm going to put it on my share screen. So lipid nanoparticles, this fatty bubble, that's what delivers the mRNA, excuse me, into the cell. The mRNA goes into the cytoplasm here. It finds a ribosome. Ribosome reads the mRNA and produces that spike protein, this little blue thing here. And then the mRNA is naturally degraded after the protein is made. That mRNA never makes it into the nucleus over here, which is where your DNA is located. So mRNA never makes it into the nucleus or interacts with DNA, and it's degraded by normal cellular processes. But you might say, but like, could it alter my DNA? All right, so here's where we're going to get sciencey. First and foremost, if this was going to happen, nuclear entry would be required. So mRNA vaccines, again, live in the cytoplasm. If we need to get them into the nucleus, they need a nuclear access signal. Things can leave the nucleus. They typically don't go back in. So you need a nuclear access signal to transport that mRNA into the nucleus here, okay? Second, you would have to convert that mRNA into DNA. mRNA and DNA are different genetic languages, so you would need a reverse transcriptase to convert that. The vaccine doesn't contain the nuclear access signal or the reverse transcriptase. And then you would need an integrase. So you would have to take that newly formed DNA and you'd have to say, integrate this into the current genome. The vaccine does not contain that integrase, so it can't integrate into the genome. So there are 3 things that the vaccine and your normal cellular processes lack for mRNA vaccines to alter your DNA. And so hopefully that's helpful for you and makes you feel more confident answering that question in the future. We get some questions about lipid nanoparticles, some concerns on social media that COVID vaccines contain nanotechnology. It interacts with 5G wireless networks, microchips, et cetera, et cetera. What does that come from? So I think it comes from the lipid nanoparticles. So the lipid nanoparticles, that's that fatty bubble. It's so small that it's measured in nanometers. And because they're engineered at that small scale, nanoscale, they're considered nanotechnology. Their purpose is really just to protect that mRNA, help it enter the cells. There's no electronics, there's no sensors, there's no microchips, tracking devices in the vaccine, and they cannot interact with 5G networks or other wireless systems. All right, I know I'm running up on time here, so we're going to quickly just talk about vaccine safety. We've talked about vaccine ingredients, but how do we know these ingredients are safe? We have videos and webinars on this topic, but I'm going to try and sum it up concisely. Vaccines don't just appear on the market. They go through years of lab research. There's preclinical testing, multiple phases of clinical trials. Before a vaccine can be licensed, it has to demonstrate that it's safe and effective. And that includes the vaccine ingredients and the full formulation as well. And then even once the vaccine is approved, the work doesn't stop. Vaccines are manufactured under strict quality standards. Every batch has to meet the same specifications. And then we have multiple post-marketing surveillance systems So once the vaccine is released to the public, these systems continue to monitor vaccines as they're used in millions of people. And if a potential safety concern is identified, it's investigated thoroughly. So that's going to bring me to three important takeaways about vaccine safety. First and foremost, vaccines are extensively studied. Routine childhood vaccines are probably the most thoroughly researched medical products in use today, second to none. Second, vaccines are held to an exceptionally high standard. We give vaccines to healthy people. We give them to healthy babies and healthy children. The safety expectations are rigorous. Tolerance for severe side effects is extremely low. Benefits have to outweigh the risks. And third, vaccine safety is just continuously monitored. Approval, once it gets FDA approval, that's not the end of the process. We have multiple safety surveillance systems that continue to monitor vaccines once they're in use. And that's what's on your slide here. The vaccine safety monitoring systems that help us monitor safety once those vaccines go out for public use. They help us detect rare side effects, track the safety of vaccines in different populations. And they're that checkpoint to help ensure that vaccines remain safe. So the last point I'm going to make here about vaccine safety is that no vaccine is 100% risk-free. It's important to acknowledge that. No medical intervention is risk-free. Nothing is risk-free. Vaccines are no exception. So vaccine side effects do occur. Some people experience side effects like soreness at the injection site, redness, fever. In very rare cases, people can have an allergic reaction to a vaccine ingredient or have another serious adverse event. Those are real, and we take those really seriously. The good news is that our tolerance for vaccine-related complications is extremely low, especially because we give vaccines to healthy people, especially because we give them to healthy children. That's why we have these robust safety surveillance systems that can detect even very rare adverse events, whether they're related to the vaccine or the vaccine ingredients. When safety signals emerge, they're thoroughly investigated, and we even update recommendations as the data supports. So I know I'm at 12:57. I'm just going to put out a plug here for recommending vaccines. When you're talking to patients about vaccines, I always recommend starting with presumption. That strong provider recommendation is correlated with increased vaccine acceptance. But there are days when you're going to have hesitant patients. And so when that happens, we recommend pivoting to motivational interviewing, using things like open-ended questions, ask permission, reflect back what you're hearing, support their autonomy, and honor the ambivalence of your patient. If the patient still declines vaccines, you've tried your best. Focus on building trust. Maintain that healthy provider-patient relationship. Respect their choice. Focus on being that trusted resource. Ask if you can talk about it the next time they're in the office. You might get to yes, but it might not be today. All right. I do want to put in a plug for our vaccine education modules. We have 19 videos online that you can get free CME for. There's 5 modules that have free continuing medical education associated with them. You can also just watch the videos if you're interested in them. They're on our YouTube page. We've had a lot of good feedback on those. Here are my 2 reference slides. I'm available for questions, and
Awesome. Thank you, Kylie, for such a fantastic presentation. Kylie, I am going to quickly turn it over and maybe ask a few questions. We got a lot of fabulous questions beforehand, so we'll try to cover a couple of those and also throughout in the Q&A. But I might start with kind of a great question I think we get a lot is, what resources do you recommend clinicians use when they need accurate information about vaccine ingredients? Where do you go?
Okay, I love that question. And I almost put a slide in here on that question. So thanks for asking it, Lauren. Okay, my go-to, like right off the cuff, is CHOP, the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. You probably saw CHOP listed on like every other slide. CHOP is fantastic. I would say personally, like CHOP is probably not like your best first option for patient-facing information, but as a healthcare provider, CHOP is phenomenal. If you're looking for just like lists of ingredients, I like the FDA package inserts. They're the FDA package inserts, but they list all of the ingredients. So that's great. Other things that I really like, I like immunize.org. There's the Institute for Vaccine Safety at Johns Hopkins. Some of my more like patient-friendly websites, like healthychildren.org is a great one. I love Voices for Vaccines, Vaccinate Your Family are just a few. I'd shout out your local immunization coalitions too. They have some great like public-facing resources available as well. So hopefully that helps give people some resources that they can use going forward.
That's fabulous. We also got a question that I know our team has talked about a lot as well. But what about vaccines to target cancer? Does it seem possible? Heard a lot about a research potentially using this type of technology for treating cancer. Do you want to talk about that at all, Kylie?
Yeah, I will start by saying I am not a cancer expert. I don't make vaccines either. I get to talk about vaccines, but that's not my wheelhouse. It does seem like there is a lot of promise out there regarding cancer vaccines, targeted immunotherapies. I think that is actually one of the benefits of the mRNA vaccine technology is very quickly we can identify maybe like the specific mutation that a specific patient has, and we could create a specific vaccine to that patient. And with the mRNA technologies, you can turn it around really fast because it's made in a lab. So that's probably the most that I know about it. I mean, I've seen the headlines like all of you, melanoma vaccines, glioblastoma vaccines. I mean, I think the possibilities are endless. And I would just say that is the reason that we need to keep funding our basic bench science and our scientists that are working on some of these key breakthroughs at the biochemical level. I'm not a bench lab scientist, but those little small breakthroughs are what are going to lead to us being able to treat more cancers and eventually integrate them into vaccines. So I'm on board. When we're ready to talk about it, I'll be first in line.
Awesome. Thanks, Kylie. I have one more here and then we'll maybe call it a day. There has been recent attention surrounding, reported safety signals related to aluminum containing vaccines and asthma. Can you explain what a safety signal is? And I know you briefly kind of talked about this, what the current evidence shows and how healthcare professionals should discuss that kind of topic with the patient.
Yeah. So some of you may remember this. So this was, I'm going to say 2022. I might be slightly off my memory since COVID. It all blurs together, right? But sometime around 2022, there was this CDC funded observational study that found this potential association between aluminum containing vaccines and persistent asthma. But it's an observational study, right? So it couldn't determine cause and effect. And when that study was published, several experts noted that there were some really important limitations. Like, so for example, asthma is influenced by a lot of factors that aren't vaccines. So like there's family history, that's a risk factor. Environmental exposures like air pollution or tobacco smoke. Early life factors like breastfeeding is protective. So these external factors in that paper were not fully accounted for. And so it's possible that the differences between those two groups, if you will, that was found in that paper could explain the findings. The other really important thing I think with this study is that this study didn't find a dose response relationship, which would happen like, so if children got more aluminum exposure, we would expect them to have a higher risk or a higher prevalence of asthma. That would strengthen the argument for that causal relationship, and we didn't see that in the paper. So since then, additional research has been conducted. I talked about the study that was published in 2025, that more comprehensive study that looked at cumulative aluminum exposure in childhood vaccines, no increased risk of autism. But this is how like my old boss, Dr. Paul Carson, used to say, like, this is how the sausage is made, right? This is how vaccine safety science is supposed to work. We identify a safety signal, we investigate them, and then we use better studies to keep further like working through that data. Like, is there an association? Is there a link? And what does that mean regarding our recommendations? So right now, the evidence supports the safety of aluminum in vaccines. There are no changes to the childhood immunization schedule that have been recommended. But if we keep studying this and new data comes out, I'm open to changing my mind on that. But we need really solid, robust studies with all of these limitations considered before we consider changing the recommendation for these vaccines because they're life-saving.
Great, excellent response. And again, just showing again how our systems are working and we're continuing to monitor these vaccines through time. I think those are some of our good questions that we've covered today. I also want to highlight and input a plugin for Siri that we'll also be putting together a supplemental handout regarding vaccine ingredients that we'll be sending out in that listserv. So make sure that you sign up so that you can get that, the slides and recording as well. Thank you again all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thanks for an excellent presentation, Kylie.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, everyone.